Hello and welcome to the Red Thread with me, Catrice Horsley. For those of you who have just jumped on to this episode, the Red Thread is all about why do we believe what we believe about ourselves and identifying the red thread, the core narrative, the core story that we hold that impacts on our behavior and our relationships, and becoming aware of that story and changing it if we want to. So, welcome to the Red Thread. Please remember to subscribe because there is news coming up about courses that I'm developing and offering, as well as lots of other stuff that may be of interest to anybody involved in storytelling, stories, developing their own stories, performing, or using stories. All about stories and the use of stories and the development of our own stories. So, today's episode, which is episode 4 in the Red Thread series, is all about on our quest to live the lives we want to live. How do we start to identify the demons along the way? And how do we start to identify the helpers? And when I say demons and helpers, they do not always have to be external. I mean, I know that I have some external helpers, some of my friends whom I can turn to in times of crisis or doubt, and who will be curious about why I'm saying what I'm saying and ask me the right questions to help me find my own right answers. However, I also know that I have internal helpers in my behavior and my belief about myself. And in the same way that I have those internal helpers and external helpers, I also have external beasts, challenges, that might be to do with the fact that I'm still not fluent in Swedish, or that I still feel that I'm not fluent enough in Swedish to be able to perform in Swedish. Um, so there might be external things like that, beasts, challenges. I don't drive in Sweden. That's an external one that I have to fight and overcome. Living in a country that's not your own and working in a way that's new within that country or that culture, that's also an external thing that I'm fighting. And then I have my internal beasts, which are the beasts that I carry that sabotage some of the work that I try to do. And that can be to do with self doubt or a belief that I've no fear, that I'm scared of driving. So battling those sorts of things. So internal and external helpers and beasts. And one of the lovely metaphors that I want to share with you is the idea that I got from my lovely friend Kat Wetherill, who's definitely one of my external helpers. She's a great storyteller and a great author. And she said to me that she felt that in life there were two types of people. There were bucket fillers, so people who you went to feeling drained and feeling empty and feeling whatever, and they would fill up your bucket, and you came away from meeting them thinking, God, I can do anything. I'm brilliant, me. And then the other type of person were the plug pullers, the people who pulled the plug from the bottom of your bucket, and just 5 minutes with them, and you felt that everything you'd ever thought was achievable was now pointless. And why did you even bother to think it? Now, I said to Kat, I love that idea, but I do also feel that we are responsible for our own plugs. And we can choose to keep them intact, or we can choose to let those people impact on us in those ways. But I did like this idea of almost planning my day to make sure that it ended with a small conversation with a bucket filler. Um, And I like this idea of, if you know that you're going to have a lot of meetings with plug pullers and a lot of those meetings where they are external beasties and challenges, that you somehow make sure that at the end of that day or those meetings, even if it's just a quick text message or a voicemail that you send to one of your bucket fillers, and them responding will enable you to fill yourself up again when you feel so depleted that you haven't got the capacity to do it yourself. So thanks to Kat Wetherill for that idea. I want to focus, I suppose, in a little bit more detail with this session on the idea of the beasts, the monsters, the demons. And I'm going to tell you why. Often we arm ourselves to battle these things. We are already on the attack or on the defensive. These cards are lovely. They're Dixit cards, and I use them all the time in my work. They have lovely illustrations. I think it's a board game originally, but you can just book the cards and buy the cards online, and they give lovely, lovely images. So it's this idea of these beasts, these challenges, and these demons, because let me tell you a secret. You can either battle them and conquer them, which is in some ways our natural instinct, to defeat them. And I think that comes from the fact that genetically we are more inclined towards that behavior in like back in the caveman days. If we weren't hyper vigilant, and if we weren't thinking that's a possible threat and I'm going to kill it, then we could have got killed. So we're kind of wired to be hyper vigilant, to protect, to see stuff as danger, rather than our first instinct, because our first instinct is for survival, rather than our first instinct possibly being curiosity and the idea of befriending something that looks like it might attack us. And I want to talk about that a little bit more. So I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were saying that they wanted to get rid of their anger. They felt that one of the things that they were really fighting with was their anger, and they just wanted to get rid of it. They weren't saying, I want to befriend my anger. They weren't saying, I want to find out what causes my anger. They weren't saying, I'm curious as to where the anger comes from. It's like, I want to get rid of it. I want to get rid of that part of me. I just want you to think of that for a second. I want to get rid of a part of myself that I'm not happy with. Because essentially, every single part of us is a part of us, and it has played and fulfilled some function in some way in enabling us to be where we are now and who we are now. And those behaviors might have come from our childhoods, where we had to be a certain way in order to survive. And now we actually don't need them anymore, but they are so much a part of our red thread. They're so woven into it that it's hard for us to separate them and not have them tug and pull in certain situations, and in certain relationships, certain triggers. But there is something about the fact that they helped us survive to where we are now. So I think there is this idea and this possibility in becoming curious about our internal demons, becoming curious about why we have them and what it was that bore them into existence. Because in some ways, we should be grateful to them because they were our tools for survival. They helped us through some serious, heavy shit. And now we're wanting to get rid of them after they've done us a great service. I was really shocked to hear that in our responses to threat, we often talk about fight, flight, or freeze. That those are our three options. And this is quoted, and I've quoted it left, right, and center. You know, it's our reptilian brain. When we're under pressure, we either fight, we either run, or we either kind of freeze and numb ourselves. And all of that research came from only researching men, because apparently in the 50s when it was done, they didn't think that women had any major stress that they had to react or survive against. But there's been more research done and it has involved women. And one of the things that women do, and it's not all women, it's not all men, but as a general pattern, is women can often befriend or connect with their threats. So in groups of women who have been taken by the enemy and they're using rape as a weapon of war against those women befriend and form relationships with their captors in order to survive. And this has caused great problems, even with in cases of rape and in cases of domestic violence, where people say, well, you went back to them, or you stayed with them, or you didn't resist, you didn't fight them, you didn't fight or run or freeze, you had a relationship with them. But actually, that is a survival technique too. And in some ways, I think that that's what we need to explore with our self-sabotaging demons. So there are a couple of examples that I'm going to give you. And this is going to be one of the exercises that I think is really useful for us in making peace and befriending those demons that have helped us on this journey to where we are now, but actually we don't need in the same way anymore. I've got my notebook here. So as an example, and I talked about this in the previous episode, any core value that is like a positive, if taken to an extreme, can become a negative. So one of the things that one of the behaviors that we can quite often see is somebody who's very responsible. They're very responsible. They make sure the bills are paid on time. They make sure the insurance is done. They make sure that the shopping's done. They make sure. And if that's taken too far, it can become controlling. And the person, if they feel that they're controlling, and if they think, I have to stop that, I have to stop this thing of me taking over the whole time, they have to, if that's one of the behaviors that they feel is self-sabotaging them, they have to look at, where does that come from? This control, this need to control. And if they start to be curious about, so what is it that makes me control so much? They might look at the fact that it's a lack of trust, because perhaps when they were younger, if they didn't do it, if they didn't look after their younger brothers and sisters, or if they didn't do whatever it was that needed to be done in the family, it wouldn't get done, perhaps because their mum had mental health problems, or their dad wasn't around, or whatever it was. And so they had to do everything. So when you become curious about the kind of flip side, the shadow side, rather than judging it, rather than saying, I don't want to be this control freak anymore, I'm going to get rid of it all. When you start to become curious about what instigated it, what was the soil that made that seed grow, then you can actually start to think, okay, it was my lack of trust in other people. I couldn't trust other people, but they were those people. And now I'm with a whole new group of people. And so if I want to start trusting in order to dilute my control, then I need to be perhaps a bit more vulnerable. So I need to work on my trust and my vulnerability. And when you start to look at it that way, I need to work on my trust of others and my vulnerability. You're not saying I need to get rid of something. I need to get rid of my control. I need to cut something out of myself. What you're saying is that is there, that control is a part of the beautiful, abundant farm that I have with all these different crops. I don't need to get rid of it, because in getting rid of it, it will impact perhaps negatively in other areas. What I need to do is develop and grow some other areas to balance the biodiversity of this abundant farm of my life. Anger. If some of you, I can get either angry or resentful. You know, you've heard my stories, you know, resentful, 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 the resentful mutter, the resentful mumble. And when the resentment gets too much, it turns into anger. I don't lose my temper a lot, but when I do, everybody knows about it and I'm not proud of it. And a lot of my anger and a lot of your anger might come from a sense of something. So rather than saying I want to get rid of my anger, it's looking at and identifying and being curious about where does that anger come from. And it might be a sense of injustice. It's not right. It's not fair. And that injustice might come from your childhood, where it wasn't right and it wasn't fair that those kids got that and they didn't get told off and they bullied you. And it wasn't fair that you got bullied the whole bloody time. And the world is unfair. It is unjust. And that is the trigger for your anger. So then when you think of that injustice, it might be linked to the fact that back then you couldn't do anything about it. You were too little, you were too young to fight back the bullies or to even articulate it. And now you still carry that. And perhaps one of the things that you need to focus on is asking for help, or in accepting that there is injustice and you can't do anything about that. You can't control that huge injustice. So letting go of that, this worldwide injustice, as though you are responsible for it all, you're not. It is not your responsibility. Letting go of that and developing a sense of what you can control and what you can't, and nourishing that. So rather than wanting to control the whole farm, and not just your farm, but everybody else's farm and all of the crops that they're growing, and they shouldn't be genetically modified and blah, 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 until you can't even see the edges of the horizon of this farm that you feel you're resentful for, you're responsible for, actually just perhaps saying, I'm going to focus on my patch, my farm, and make as much change and create as much justice in the area I have responsibility for as I can, because you don't have responsibility for all the other stuff, but you have responsibility for your own small plot. So one of the tasks that I would invite you to do is to look at the behaviors that you feel are sabotaging yourself, and to think of and to trace back, where did they come from? How did they protect you? And if you don't want to constantly have that part of your red thread snagged and react on the fabric of your life, what other areas is it possible to focus on to diffuse the power of that? So your task is to be curious, not to judge your behaviors, but to be curious about where those behaviors came from, how they helped you survive, and what you can see on the other side of them that you can nourish in order to balance out those behaviors and to dilute them in your lives. So I hope that was useful. And please remember to subscribe to the channel. There is an Instagram page all about the red thread too, where I'm going to post more bits and bobs and quotes that I love. The next episode after this one is going to be all about our imagined selves and how we can go through a very specific technique to try and reach this idea of ourselves in our futures and to break it down into smaller steps that are perhaps far more achievable. So that'll be the next episode. Thank you for listening. Remember to subscribe and have a absolutely wonderful day. Bye bye for now.